Islam is in need of a reformation. Have you heard this before? Yes, Islam has problems, so the argument goes, but so did Christianity until the Reformation came along. Not only does this position compare apples with oranges, but it overlooks the little-known fact that what is today called radical Islam is, believe it or not, a byproduct of the Reformation of Islam. Even more shocking, it follows, as I will presently demonstrate, the same pattern of Christianity's Protestant Reformation. Much of the confusion has to do with our understanding of the word reform. So let's start there. Despite its positive connotations, reform, according to most dictionaries, means something like to make changes in something, typically a social, political, or economic institution or practice, in order to improve it. Synonyms of reform include make better, ameliorate, and improve. These are all splendid words, yet only because they're being infused with Western connotations, which are not applicable for Islam. Instead, Muslim notions of improving society may include purging it of infidels and their corrupt ways, or executing apostates and blasphemers. Banning many forms of freedoms, which are seen in the West today as products of long years of reform, from religious freedom to gender equality, can be deemed an improvement and a betterment of society from a Muslim paradigm. In short, an Islamic reformation need not lead to what Western people think of as an improvement and betterment of society, simply because Western peoples are not Muslims and do not share their reference points and first premises. Reform only sounds good to most non-Muslims because they attribute Western ideas to the word. Now let's look at the Protestant Reformation. At its core, it was a revolt against ecclesiastical authority and tradition in the name of Scripture, in this case the Bible. With the coming of the printing press, increasing numbers of Christians became better acquainted with the Bible's contents, parts of which they felt contradicted what the church was teaching. So they broke away, protesting that the only Christian authority was Scripture alone, sola scriptura. Believe it or not, Islam's Reformation follows the same logic, specifically by prioritizing Scripture over centuries of tradition and legal debate among Muslim scholars, but with antithetical results that reflect the antithetical teachings of Christianity and Islam. As with Christianity, throughout most of its history, Islam's scriptures, specifically its twin pillars, the Quran, the literal words of Allah, and the Hadith, the words and deeds of Allah's Prophet Muhammad, were inaccessible to the overwhelming majority of Muslims. Only a very few scholars, the ulama, literally they who know, were literate and or had possession of Islam's scriptures. The average Muslim knew only the basics of Islam, 5 pillars. Times have radically changed, no pun intended. Millions of more Qurans, published in Arabic and other languages, are in circulation today compared to just a century ago. Millions of more Muslims are now literate enough to read and understand the Quran compared to their medieval ancestors. The Hadith, which contains some of the most intolerant teachings attributed to Islam's prophet, is now collated and accessible for free on the internet, where all of Islam's core texts are also available in dozens of languages and to anyone with a laptop or smartphone. As a result, many of today's Muslims, much better acquainted than their ancestors with the often black and white words of their scriptures, are protesting against earlier traditions and the sometimes elastic fatwas of the ulama in favor of scriptural literalism, just like their Christian Protestant counterparts once did. Thus, if Martin Luther rejected what he characterized as extra-scriptural accretions of the church and reformed Christianity by aligning it strictly with scripture, consider the actions of Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, whence comes the word Wahhabis, who died around 1787. Known as one of Islam's first modern reformers, and certainly a radical in Western parlance, he, in the words of Bernard Lewis, quote, called for a return to the pure, authentic Islam of the Prophet and the rejection of the accretions that had corrupted it and distorted it. That's from his book, The Middle East, page 333. The unadulterated words of God, or Allah in this case, are all that matter for the reformists. Amongst Muslims, the most up-and-coming reformers who follow the scriptural literalism of Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab are the Salafists, they who care only about what Muhammad and his earliest followers said and did as captured in the Quran and the Hadith. Now here's the really interesting part. How can Christianity and Islam follow similar patterns of reform but with antithetical results? Quite simply because their scriptures are antithetical to one another. This is the key point, one of course totally unintelligible to postmodern secular sensibilities, which tend to lump all religious scripture together in a melting pot of relativism without bothering to evaluate the significance of their respective words. Here are just a few obvious contradictions. The New Testament preaches peace, brotherly love, tolerance, and forgiveness for all humans, believers and non-believers alike. Conversely, the Quran and Hadith call for war, jihad, against all non-believers until they either convert, accept subjugation and discrimination, or die. That's the Quran 9:5, 9:29, etc. The New Testament prescribes no punishment for the apostate from Christianity. Conversely, Islam's prophet himself decreed in a canonical hadith that, quote, whoever changes his Islamic religion, kill him, unquote. The New Testament teaches monogamy, one husband and one wife, thereby dignifying the woman. The Quran allows polygamy, up to 4 wives, and the possession of limitless concubines, sex slaves. The New Testament discourages lying. The Quran permits it. The Prophet himself often deceived others and allowed his followers to lie, including to their wives in the famous hadith. It is precisely because Christian scriptural literalism lends itself to religious freedom, tolerance, and the dignity of women that Western civilization developed the way it did. And it is precisely because Islamic scriptural literalism is at odds with the religious freedom, tolerance, and the dignity of women that Islamic civilization developed the way it did. Those in the West waiting for an Islamic Reformation along the same lines of the Protestant Reformation must embrace 2 facts. First, Islam's Reformation has already been well on its way, and yes, along the same lines of the Protestant Reformation, with a focus on scripture and a disregard for tradition and clerical authority, and for similar historical reasons, literacy, scriptural dissemination, etc., as we've seen. But because the core teachings of the scriptures of Christianity and Islam are markedly different, Islam's Reformation has naturally produced a civilization markedly different from the West. Let's be honest, the Islamic Reformation some in the West are hoping for is really nothing less than an Islam without Islam. Secularization, not reformation. Muslims prioritizing secular, civic, and humanitarian laws over Allah's laws. A reformation, or rather enlightenment, that would slowly see the religion of Muhammad go into the dustbin of history. Such a scenario, the demise of Islam, is actually more plausible than believing that Islam can be true to its scriptures in any meaningful way and still peacefully coexist with, much less complement, the modern world the way Christianity does.